Good afternoon, everybody. It is Wednesday, the 7th of September. As you know from the announcements, we have Dr. Siegfried Othmer with us today. He's going to be doing a presentation. You've read about his background on the announcements, so without doing a lot of introductory stuff, uh, Siegfried and his wife Sue have been so active as pioneers in this field and continue to do cutting edge and leading work, and he's with us today. All right, Siegfried, it's all yours. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy you're
Okay.
here.
Yeah, well, it's going to be a wild ride, so I hope people are sitting down and in a place where they're not going to spill their coffee as this thing unfolds. So our life has been quite exciting, as some of you know, and it just continues. So anyway, here's the story. The big theme is endogenous neuromodulation, which we see as the culmination of our 37-year journey facilitating the brain's recovery and optimal functioning with a focus on optimal functioning, but of course we're dealing with a clinical population. And our way of doing this is just simply enhancing the brain's self-regulatory competence. So another way of looking at our theme is, we've been in the field now of infra-low frequency neurofeedback, below 0.1 hertz, since for about 16 years now, 17, going on 17 years. But the endogenous neuromodulation is actually the bigger topic that includes infra-low frequency neurofeedback. So we'll be talking about both themes. Neuroregulation, there's kind of two ways to go about it. The conventional way that we do in neurofeedback is with exogenous, what we call exogenous neuromodulation. Some sort of external agency, right? We either do challenge-based training, either via stimulation or reinforcement. It's model-driven. We have an idea in our head as to what we're after. It's formulaic. It's prescriptive. It's top-down. We're in charge of things. We typically are after a narrow target in the immediate sense of neurofeedback, even though we have larger objectives clinically. And often we're looking for something very specific in its effects. We're looking for specific remedies. But there's another approach, which we call endogenous neuromodulation. And this is now an autonomous process where we kind of let the brain take the lead. So it's hypothesis driven. We still have an idea in our head as to what's going on, but now it's empirically guided. So it's bottom up. It's see what the brain does with a signal and then react to that. So we're the respondents. We're not the agents. We're the respondents. And so it's self-referential, right? It's the brain sort of engaged with itself, and necessarily because the brain is always system focused. The training is system focused, right? It's the whole brain that's sort of in the game, and therefore we're looking for broad and general effects. Now this journey toward endogenous neuromodulation has been going on actually for all of our 37 years. We didn't think about it in those terms until we got into infra-low frequency neurofeedback. But actually, endogenous neuromodulation has been part of our scheme since the beginning, and in fact, it played a role in Sturman's work too. So we'll hopefully make that clear as we go on. So anyway, it's involved a progression toward more of a systems level conception of what's going on. Obviously, the brain should be seen as a complex self-organizing system. And how do those such complex systems improve themselves? How do they learn how to function? It's actually by endless trial and error going on all the time. And so our brains actually got here by trial and error, right? Just a continuous process of trial and error at gross level and refined level. And so for us, we do the same thing. It's been trial and error. So it's been a progression from the historical protocols that Barry Sturman left us to hypothesis-guided trial and error methods. So we effectively now we train the brain in the same way that it learned regulation in the first place, right? So we're kind of trying to operate in the brain schema rather than in our own schema. So what happens in endogenous neuromodulation? The brain now responds to a self-generated challenge. The signal itself is the challenge, right? The brain looks at the signal we're giving it, and it recognizes itself in that signal. It says, okay, this is me, or some aspect of my function on display here on the screen. That's important. I need to pay attention to that, because everything that relates to me is important to me, right? The brain is the most narcissistic entity in the universe. So there's no imposed goal, and there are no extrinsic rewards. So we can call this training self-referential, right? It's just the brain playing with that signal because it regards it as important, which of course it is. All right, so this means that the process is occurring within paradigm, right? We're not challenging the brain out of its schema. It's just the brain engaging with a signal. So the brain is operating in its own space. Now, you might say that statement is tautologous because the brain is always operating in its own space, right? It doesn't know about anything else, right? It's neural networks talking. It's the neural conversation. The brain doesn't know about anything else. But I am actually saying something here. The process is effectively internalized. There are no externalities like rewards and stuff like that. So this means that the process of neurofeedback now operates at a very refined level, at the level at which self-regulation must proceed in the natural state. When you're not doing neurofeedback but just walking around, your brain is regulating at a very refined level. And with a neurofeedback where we're not disturbing things, we're just simply letting the brain operate on the signal. Kind of the same thing happens. It's at that refined level, right? The brain continues to work pretty much as it was working. And so we can assert, I think, that such a level of refinement can only be met by way of endogenous neuromodulation. So we think of endogenous neuromodulation as we can think of it as kind of a finishing tool, that whatever else you do in neurofeedback, this is a good finishing tool. Okay, so anyway, with regard to this internalization, I've made the following graph, and I don't know whether this helps. So we can think of the brain having a whole bunch of internal feedback loops, but then we provide an external feedback loop. And typically that now involves rewards and inhibits and all of that, but we're now saying, no, none of that, no rewards. We do have inhibits, but that's not part of the story at the moment. And anyway, no discrete rewards. So the brain is just watching its signal. So that's much easier to internalize. The brain simply says, that's me, right? And it goes to work on the signal. So it's more complete. All neurofeedback is internalized by the brain, but ours is more completely internalized, right? There's nothing else. Okay. So endogenous neuromodulation actually evolved out of the Sturman method. That is to say, it's mechanisms-based, protocol-based, used a bipolar montage. People forget that, but Barry Sturman's early work and Lubar's also all was done with bipolar montage. And we learned neurofeedback from Margaret Ayers. She stuck with that, and we stuck with that. It turns out it makes a lot of sense. And by now, of course, we realize, hey, that's just a way of doing connectivity training. Okay, so the feedback was based on discrete rewards in the case of Barry, but he also displayed the EEG dynamics in the early system that Margaret Ayers used in her training, and that we copied into the neurocybernetics. And then, of course, Lubar contributed the inhibit design. Sturman had an inhibit design also, but Lubar, pushed that further. So now, what set us on a new track was this watershed event, sort of 1996, 97, the discovery of the principle of optimal response frequency. And of course, this wasn't an event, this was actually a process. So gradually Sue realized, wait a minute, some people respond very much more strongly at some frequencies than others. So here I'm showing you extracting from the raw signal 3 signals that are nearby in frequency: 11 hertz, center, 8 to 11, 8.5 to 11.5, 9 to 12. So half hertz apart. And if you look at these signals, you can hardly tell them apart. Now imagine giving the feedback to the brain on these 3 signals, and then the brain responds differently to one versus the other. What the heck is going on? So this is the kind of thing that we're dealing with. So, for us, the signal is an observation, but for the brain, it is an experience. And what this clarifies for us is that the brain is getting more out of the signal than we do, right? And more out of the signal than we intend. But that's true only if you expose the signal to the dynamics, right? The dynamics at the training frequency, which actually was incorporated in Barry Sterman's first system, which was sitting in Margaret Ayer's office, and that we copied that into neurocybernetics, and that turned out to be critical. Okay, here I'm showing those same 3 bands, and here it's easier to tell the difference, right? So if you look at it spectrally, you can tell indeed those 3 are different. But anyway, no question, the brain can tell the difference. So that led us then to this optimization procedure, where we realized in many cases, particularly those where we had difficulty getting it right with people, we needed to find their optimal response frequency, the frequency at which they were most calm, most alert, and most euthymic, as euthymic as that nervous system was capable of being under those circumstances, as we're dealing mainly with clients with a lot of symptoms. Okay, so that became then the driver. Every problematic client with a lot of, that was highly dysregulated, we needed to find the optimal response frequency. Now, my background is physics, and I understand this in terms of a resonant system response. So there's special frequencies in the brain that organize the entire frequency spectrum. And if you find those frequencies, then the training is particularly efficient, more efficient than if you do it anywhere else. Okay, so here's the system response. This is the real signal. But we need to regard resonance in the complex plane, and there's also an imaginary component, which is complex. We don't need to get into the details, but anyway, this confuses things in the real world. The imaginary component has a real effect. Okay, and so what happens is that in actual experience, when we walk the frequency up or down, typically down from higher frequency, that's typically the way we do things, we get to the point where a person may actually start to feel just a touch worse or more equivocal, like, I don't know what's going on here, and then suddenly feels better. And then if we go a little bit further, it starts worse again. So there's clearly this peak. And so the game becomes one of finding this peak for these people, and then we train at that resonance. So it depends a great deal on how severely dysregulated the person is. So somebody like myself, who's not plagued with a lot of symptoms, I have great difficulty finding my ORF, or I don't find it at all. Clinicians find it. But it's a way of, sort of trial and error over many sessions and so forth, because, again, I don't have a lot of symptoms to work with. But if somebody is strongly symptomatic, then it's much more obvious on both sides, the positive and the negative. So it's, this is the game now, finding this frequency. Okay. So I've already said this. Frequency sensitivity that I talked about earlier with that slide does not exist in the general case. It really exists only near the resonance frequency, right? That makes the training suddenly very frequency dependent, but only right there, not in general. And so you might say, well, wait a minute, I don't experience that at all. Well, that's because, wherever you're moving the frequency around, you're probably not at the resonance frequency. Okay. And it's likely to be observed only in sensitive responders and those who are highly dysregulated, right? You don't observe this in the general case. Okay, so the game is then for the clinician to find the optimum frequency, and basically everything goes into the pot. So all the symptoms, you're watching all the symptoms, and you're watching the person sitting in the chair, seeing how they react to the movement of the frequency, and so you try to minimize what we call an index of dysregulation, where you have in the back of your mind all the things, all the observables that relate to that person that you can think of, that you have available in the session, and then an index of functionality. You know, how alert is he, how calm, how euthymic. And basically that's, you know, that all converges at one frequency. And this turns out to be the efficient training frequency, the most efficient training frequency. So just to review, the essential elements of the method are exclusive reliance on bipolar montage. So we're training the relationship between the sites. Reliance on a continuous signal for feedback. So we're effectively training on the EEG dynamics. We have always done dynamic thresholding on the rewards and the inhibits. And then now we have individualization of the training frequency. So basically our inhibit scheme was just a bunch of inhibits all across the spectrum. And then we had to find the optimum response frequency by moving up or down in this range from 0 to 40 hertz. And you might need to go up or down. You never knew. Okay. But it turns out the most challenging and least stable clients tended to move toward the bottom of the range. And we see here, this is sort of the 0 to 17 hertz spectrum, that these frequencies are down here can be very well defined. So by 2004, we're at the bottom of the range. And with our system, the neurocybernetics had a 3 hertz bandwidth, so we bumped up against the bottom. So that gave us sort of a bottom frequency of 1.5 hertz center frequency. When we looked in 2005, just looked over our database over a period of 6 months, we saw a distribution which was fairly flat across, SMR down. This is where we've done most of our training early on, right? 15 to 18 hertz. Margaret Ayers just did a lot of beta training, so did we. And that virtually disappeared. Wait a minute, what happened to it? That was our favorite protocol. And but the fact of the matter is these are 3 hertz bins. And so actually each of these bins contains three 1 hertz bins, right? Whereas this bin here, 0 to 3, only has one 1 hertz wide bin, because that center frequency is 1.5. And so if you were to see these data in terms of 1 hertz bins, this one would be 3 times as high. In other words, where people were piling up at the bottom, it says, okay, we need to go lower. And that meant we needed a different system. We used BioExplorer software that got us down to 0.05 with a 0.1 corner frequency, 0.05 center frequency. And you see the optimum response frequencies were all over the spectrum. Out here, we're out here at 33 hertz. But then we have this pile up at the bottom. And here it is an expanded range. Here we're looking at the guys below 1 hertz. And there's still this pile up at the very bottom. So we need to go further. Here it is an expanded scale. So we've got this, the biggest bin, most populated bin is at 0.05. So that it was like snowdrift up against the fence. Our clients were piling up at the bottom. It says, okay, well, what else is going on down here? So it turns out the pileup became even more obvious than it was before, rather than less. We thought that people would distribute themselves over this band, but no, they concentrated themselves on the bottom. So, okay, now how do we understand this? Obviously, the lower frequencies set the context for the higher ones, right? It's text versus context. So when we're training state regulation, the lower frequencies are favored with respect to the higher frequencies. And now it turns out the lower we go, the more true that is. Okay, we learn. And now we have from Buzaki, this nice partitioning of the EEG spectrum into a whole bunch of subbands. And they all have their functional role, and so that's the splitting perspective, right? But we also have the lumping perspective where we say, look, if we look at the spectral over the same range from 1 hertz to 100 hertz, this is a log plot, we see one power law coefficient, right? One coefficient. So it all obeys one governing law. Okay, so we have functional segmentation across the frequency regime, but we have it under the umbrella of a single organizing principle, which is this power law distribution, which generally characterizes dynamically self-organizing systems, such as the brain. And once again, the lower frequencies establish the context for the higher bands. So now we go lower. Here we are at 1 millihertz at the bottom. And guess what? The pileup at the bottom gets worse, not better. Again, we expected people to distribute themselves. Well, some of them did. But there was still this pileup at the bottom. I said, well, okay, they can't all be optimizing at 1 millihertz. There must be more to the story. So we needed to go even lower. So here's the journey. So by December 2008, we were at 1 millihertz. By March 2010, we were at 10th millihertz. In 2015, we went to 0.01 millihertz at the bottom of the range, 10 microhertz. In 2017, we went to 1 microhertz. In 2019, we went to 0.1 microhertz. And just this year, earlier this year, we went to 0.01 microhertz. Now, you might say this is an absurdity. But of course, you need to realize we're not actually training at that frequency, right? We're training the dynamics of the rhythm that's organized at that frequency. We don't see this frequency. I mean, this takes forever, right? This is, well, I don't know how long it is, but it's anyway. This doesn't move very much in phase during a 30-minute session or 50-minute session, right? We're looking at the dynamics, of course, and the dynamics are relevant even at these low frequencies, right? If we didn't see real-time dynamics, then these rhythms would just be irrelevant to our project, and things would come to a halt. So then we subjected a graduate student to a 3-hour ordeal, sitting there and letting us take his EEG, capture his EEG with a 19 or 31 channel system. So anyway, all these are the individual channels, and then there's the average. So basically, and I'm comparing this with the older one. So the older plot from Buzaki has 1 hertz to 100 hertz. Here we're going 4 orders of magnitude lower to 10 to the minus 4th, right? And it's still one coefficient, one power law. This is breathtaking. Oh my God, right? There's one organizing principle that covers both the infra-low frequency region and the EEG region out to about 10 hertz. What happens here, Lord knows what happens. Is maybe it was an exciting movie. You know, things happen up here. But anyway, this region is all very well behaved. Okay, and the power law coefficient turns out to be 1.5, which is what is expected for self-organizing systems that live at the edge of criticality. You know, what does that mean? Criticality, it means it's in a maximally adaptive state, consistent with the maintenance of global stability, which of course the brain needs. Okay, so what are we really seeing here? We're seeing the frequency regime divided into the realm of the neurons, which you know, peters out about 0.1 to 0.5 hertz, and then the realm of the glia. And this is illustrated by the frequency rules that apply to this method, which I'll get to in a moment. So here we are. So what happens is that the optimal response frequency differs between the right and the left hemisphere. So if we plot the right hemisphere optimal frequency horizontally, let's say we're 10 hertz in a particular case, then if we move to the left hemisphere, we need to be 2 hertz higher. And this works all across the EEG range. It works all the way up to 100 hertz. But if we go to the infra-low frequency region, let's say we're at, let's say 1 millihertz here. I don't even have units here. Let's call this 1 millihertz. Then at the left side, we have to double it and go to 2 millihertz. So it's logarithmically organized. I mean, it's geometrically organized in the infralow, and it's arithmetically organized in the EEG range. And of course, there has to be a transition range, and that happens to be right in delta, the region of 2 to 4 hertz. So 2 hertz on the right turns into 4 hertz on the left. And so we think of this as follows. We think that above 4 hertz, the left hemisphere is kind of dominant for the brain organization, and below 2 hertz on the right, it's basically the glial system that's in charge, and the crossover region is basically the delta band, which none of us understand very well for these obvious reasons, right? It's really where clarity does not prevail. We've got well, anyway, we got this confusion going on. Okay, and the protocols are invariant across the EEG and ILF domains. Same mechanisms are targeted either way. And when it comes to differential, the bipolar training, it's mainly interhemispheric or lateralized. And when it comes to synchrony training, it's mainly front, back, or also lateralized. Okay, so here are the protocols. Basically, we spent the early 2000s, Sue spent, and this is all Sue's work. You know, I'm just a bystander. I don't do the clinical work, and I get to talk about it because I have the PhD. But this is basically all Sue's clinical work. So she basically explored all the interhemispheric placements and all the lateralized placements that have T3 and T4 in common. And then things rattled down to where we ended up with the important ones. This is what was left over. So an important one was T4, P4. An important one was T3, T4. But basically, you notice that we take care of the quadrants. First of all, we take care of the hemispheric division, and then the front back division, right? So we have 4 quadrants that we take care of in this fashion. So we had it's sort of like zone offense, neurofeedback, zone defense. But anyway, we target 2 principal failure modes: arousal regulation and cerebral stability, because those are issues with everybody that walks in, right? So that's our organizing principle. We start out getting that right, and then we deal with the details. And when it comes to the brain instabilities, they are governed principally by interhemispheric coordination. Now, this is important to anybody who does neurofeedback anywhere on the planet by any means whatsoever. If they're working with the brain instabilities, they need to work interhemispherically in addition to whatever else they do. Okay. So what are we talking about here? We're talking about seizures, migraines, panic, asthma, suicidal episodes, narcolepsy, vertigo, POTS, just sudden radical changes of state that leave the person somewhat dysfunctional. We call brain instabilities. Okay, and then this is the system's perspective in the view of a neurofeedback practitioner. And what we basically come down to is that the regulatory priority is actually the right hemisphere. It's this regulatory arc: interoception, our internal sense of the body, autonomic regulation, affect regulation, and arousal regulation, right? So when we tend to arousal regulation, we get to this axis here in the infralow frequency region. So the right hemisphere is becoming our priority. We started life over here, but that almost takes care of itself if you take care of this. So we end up with a therapeutic hierarchy. There's first of all the frequency hierarchy from infralow to EEG. from the lowest frequencies to the high. There's the hierarchy of regulation, from going from general function to specific state, from state related to function specific. And then there's the developmental hierarchy. What happens first? It's core regulation that happens first, which is for the infant actually affect regulation, right? And with affect regulation comes arousal regulation. Okay, so steady state regulation is the infant's burden. And then eventually specific or a transient state regulation. And all three of these jointly inform the therapeutic hierarchy. And now we're saying in this developmental perspective, it makes sense to begin at the bottom, begin bottom up at the low frequencies and with the right hemisphere. So what has the journey to the deep ILF accomplished for us? By going back to the foundations of our regulatory hierarchy, we are effectively going back to the early developmental stages and remolding the clay. So this has allowed us to redress the problems of developmental trauma, of birth trauma, mild head injuries in early childhood, all those things that we thought we were stuck with. We can quite possibly loosen the moorings and remold the clay. By the way, this is how our son Brian, who got us into this with his epilepsy, described his own training. He said this is like remolding the clay. He was interested in pottery and did some nice things in pottery. And if you didn't fire the clay, you could always remold it. Just wet the thing and remold it, right? Once you fired it, the game was up. But as long as you hadn't fired it yet, hadn't committed it to the kiln, you could remold the clay. And he realized this was also true of his own brain. So these, of course, developmental trauma, birth trauma, early head injury, which everybody ignores, are the biggest factors in psychopathology, right? We now know. And not only in psychopathology, but in terms of physical health outcomes, chronic medical disease as well. And now we realize, we learned all this, of course, largely with adults, but we realized we could do this at any age, right? And go back and remold the clay. Okay, so this was a rapid journey through the terrain.
Well, thank you, Siegfried. Excellent presentation. Appreciate your time today. We know you're a busy person, but we certainly appreciate your being here. And
I tell you, this is what I live for. We got to spread the word. And we've got such a wonderful tool here, and we just got to spread the enthusiasm and get more people into the field.
And we'll do that, and we'll get you back.
Okay.
Yep. Okay. Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye, everybody. See you Friday.